Welcome everybody. I'm Lekobi. I'm right now at Mercado Libre. I'm the head of the open source program office, and here with me is JJ. He's an investor of the open source ecosystem. He incurred the commercial open source term. And hey, JJ, how you doing? Let's
I'm doing good. Thank you
introduce.
for having me.
Okay, let's talk with the audience. Introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, most people call me JJ. My name is Joseph Jacks. I'm the founder of a investment company called OSS Capital. OSS stands for Open Source Software, and we invest exclusively in companies that are based on a core open source technology or project of some kind. So some examples of popular open source companies you've probably heard of are like HashiCorp, GitLab, obviously Red Hat as a historical example, Elastic, Confluent, many others. So, and our focus is to invest very early and help build sort of the next generation of open source company founders. And yeah, we've been doing that for 4 years now, since 2018. And we've invested in about 50 companies all around the world, South America, Canada, Europe, Asia, and obviously in the United States, Estados Unidos. Very, very happy to chat with you today.
Okay, great. It's great to have you here. And if you are okay, let me start with the first question.
Sounds good.
Okay, you are an open source investor, right? And I'm assuming, and let me know if I'm wrong, that you're doing this for two main reasons. The first, I think the obvious one, is to make profit, of course. And second, because in some way you believe in open source. Am I right? If in that case.
Yeah, I would say I would do the opposite order.
The
I think
opposite.
The first reason is I love open source, and also to be more specific, I think more detailed reason for the first motivation, the first driver for what I'm doing and what OSS Capital stands for is we basically believe that open source is sort of eating software much faster than software is eating the world. So maybe you heard this term, software is eating the world. We think that open source is eating software itself a lot faster than software is eating the world. So there's sort of two curves. One curve is looking at software eating the world, basically, and then the other curve is open source companies really eating software. And I'm sharing my screen. I'm not sure if this will come up in the presentation, but the graph on the top here is software eating the world, right? So VMware, Salesforce, Unity, Notion, all these big software companies. What we focus on is the bottom wave, which is open source eating software. So in the whole technology industry, there's about $20 trillion, maybe $10 to $20 trillion in value market cap with software companies, digital technology companies. In open source companies, we call them commercial open source companies or cost companies. This bottom wave, the smaller wave. Since we really started to see this category grow really fast in the last 10 years, it went from like 10 billion in size to about 400 to 500 billion in size in the last 10 years. So it's still pretty small. This way of building a sort of a technology company really built on and developed on a core open source technology. It's very different. It's very unusual, and it's very misunderstood. And so that's basically what we focus on. And we really try to find and encourage the entrepreneurs all over the world in the next generation to build their startups using, with the first step one, they build an open source project, and then really grow the community, grow the users, and grow the impact of that open source project. And at the same time as staying committed to the open source philosophy, also building a business and building a company around the open source project and building products, building services for customers. And so we think that these companies are much better for the world. They're more environmentally friendly, basically. They're more sustainable. So kind of like how Tesla, SpaceX are focused on accelerating a sustainable future in our physical world, open source companies are accelerating a sustainable future in our digital world. And so that's basically what what I focus on.
So you would say that perhaps your driver is 80-20 or the 50-50, 60-40?
No, I think the main driver is accelerating sustainability in the digital world. I think it just so happens that because these companies can make such a big impact, when you build products and services for customers and customers prefer those open products and services over the proprietary products and services, you have the opportunity to also build a big business. But I would say the fundamental reason is not to make a profit, is not to generate a lot of revenue. The fundamental reason is to accelerate an open future. And over the course of that progression, there will absolutely be a huge amount of value transferred from the old way, which is fully proprietary closed businesses, to open core businesses, and many trillions of dollars in value as well. So absolutely, we can make a lot of money, we can generate a lot of revenue, we can build very valuable businesses. Many of them can go public, but the primary reason for building companies this way is to drive sustainability in the digital world, basically.
Awesome. Okay, that drives me to the second question was, so what do you look for in an open source project when you are considering investment? What kind of KPIs do you look?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of data in the open source community with projects. You can see pretty much all of the data around the development. You can't see too much of the data around adoption and how the software is actually being used, because this is kind of invisible and sort of pseudonymous, almost anonymous. But in terms of the actual development of the technology, you can see the developer contribution, the developer activity, the features, the bug fixes, the test releases, the documentation, the roadmap. You can see how active all of this data is by looking just at the what's called the commit graph on the Git activity. Most of that data is actually on GitHub or GitLab, and other communities over time in the next decades will probably start to develop as well. And you can see all this data. The data that we look at mostly is related to really the activity of the project and the contribution. Really, the contribution velocity, I think, is the main thing that we look at. So how high is the rate of development activity in the project? Could be one developer, could be 100 developers, it could be 500 developers. Higher number of developers obviously is interesting, but we care a lot more about how fast the rate of innovation and the rate of iteration is with the project. So if you see one project that has 5 or 6 commits to the code base in 1 month, and then you have another project that has 50 or 100 commits to the code base, and you can see a lot of progress and there's a lot of fixes and it's improving in 1 month, we like the second project a lot better than the first project. So that's just one example. On a more qualitative side of things, so that's quantitative. On a more qualitative, we actually really look closely at what market the project is addressing a problem in. So is it for a new programming language, or is it for some new web framework, or is it for some web scraping thing, or maybe is it an application? Is it a database? Is it a system of record? We look at that very closely. The reason that's very important for a qualitative piece is when we make an investment in a team that wants to build a company around an open source project, that market that the project is addressing and operating in really has to be either one of two things, either very slow innovation and lots of monopoly. So there's like maybe 2 or 3 big proprietary tools, and the innovation is slow. So that means there's opportunity for innovation. Or there could be some new category that this project is trying to create a solution for. And it's kind of like a composition or like a combination of existing markets that are growing really fast or are already very large. And so we try to look at that really closely because our focus on investing is very early stage. We invest when the company doesn't exist, typically. And so we find the project that we get excited about, and then we basically help the maintainer, the open source creator, start a company around the project and help them incorporate. We've done this like 20 times all over the world in many different countries. And then we invest when it's very, very early. And the reason we have to have this market understanding is our investment time frame is typically 7 to 10 years. It's a very, very long period of time. So when we make an investment, we really have to have a lot of conviction. We have to have a lot of belief that if things go right, if things actually happen on a good path, then the outcome for a company could be really huge. It could be $5 billion, $10 billion, $50 billion in 10 years or something like that, right? So that's basically what we look for. I would say that those are some of the quantitative, qualitative. Really, the most important thing, though, that we look at is who's actually building the project and who is going to be growing and building the company. In almost all the cases for us, it's been the same person. So the same people that really are the stewards and the maintainers for the project. They're the same people that start the company. That makes things a lot easier in terms of how they can invest the best energy and the best resources to continue sustaining the open source project, continue investing a lot of time and energy in it. They also have the right incentive structure. They have the right kinds of alignment. The other thing that we really look for is humility, intellectual honesty, and just an incredible passion and mission-driven purpose connected to what the project is solving. So the people really have to be very, very mission-driven about why is the project created in the first place, and are they really dedicated to investing many years of their life doing this? If it requires money, if it requires the venture capital dollars for them to continue, we don't want to invest. If it requires their heart and they're deeply committed to building this, even if no one gave them any money, that's when we get much more excited, because money will never solve the most important problem, which is long-term commitment. In fact, some money, even not that much money, sometimes does the opposite. It makes people lazy. It gives people excuses to work less. And so we have to be extremely sensitive to, is the founder of the company around the project, who also created the project, truly mission driven? And do they really deeply care? Do they have a personal connection, a personal purpose to the problem space? And with open source, I mean, you probably won't be surprised. It's actually pretty easy. Open source maintainers, the ones that are building projects that start to get a lot of adoption and start to become successful, they're very, very mission-driven people. They really deeply, deeply care about what they're doing. But we still have to test for that and really kind of understand that a lot more.
Do you weight the community around the open source project, or that doesn't even matter?
We have invested at the stage where there's very, very little community, where there's like 100 users and very small communities. We've also invested where there's millions of users and there's like huge communities. We definitely look at that. The thing that we care more about is the rate of growth. How fast is the community growing? Like I was mentioning earlier, it's actually kind of impossible to have all the data to be completely confident about how fast a community is growing. The GitHub stars, they don't actually tell you the real data. This is a small part of the story. Interesting data. The GitHub stars gives you some interesting metric on maybe sentiment or how many people kind of give like a thumbs up, and it's exciting, but it's not actually telling you how big the community is, how many users are there, and things like that. But we look at the rate of growth. That's a pretty big thing that we look at for the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a long shot for you guys. You are looking for a world in 10 years. It's a lot for software.
Yeah, that's true.
That's oh, okay. About a year ago, in a previous interview, in a previous talk, you said that you were confident that the cost ecosystem is the next $2 trillion tech category. Okay, what evidence do you have to believe that?
Yeah, I think we actually have some pretty impressive evidence for that. Like I was showing you in the slides earlier, 10 years ago in 2010, well, 12 years ago, the entire costs, as you said, category was only about $10 billion in size, the whole category, all the open source businesses combined. And the largest one was Red Hat at the time, which was like 90% of that value, right? But Red Hat was, I think about a $10 billion company then. So like basically it was only Red Hat. Now we have more than more than 12 companies that have gone public, multi-billion-dollar outcomes. There have been $24 billion invested in the venture capital investment space into these businesses, into commercial open source startups, just in the last 3 years. And the entire category value today is worth about $400 billion. So it's grown by 40 times in the last decade, 40. This is an enormous rate of growth. This is a very, 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 very fast rate of growth. We are now experiencing the largest market collapse correction in the history of the technology industry, including the dot-com 2000 collapse from 99 to 2001, 2002, massive collapse. So I think that the rate of growth will continue because open source projects are free to use, they're very capital efficient, and they provide a huge amount of leverage for businesses with basically zero capital spend other than the time from the developer and the time from the engineering teams to actually use the projects and make use of them. So I think that as businesses really maybe cut the spending on the proprietary products and they start to invest more in efficient, very capital efficient alternatives, which is largely open source, I think in the next 3 years, as we continue to see this correction in the markets, open source will continue to grow dramatically. The interesting thing is to get to a $2 trillion category from what it is today, we don't need to even grow by 10 times. We just need to grow the current size by like 5 times from what it is today. So just remember, in the last decade, it grew by 40 times. So in the next decade, by 2030, right, we only need to grow by 5 times from today to get to $2 trillion in total size. This doesn't mean that. So one thing that I think a lot of people misunderstand when I say this, because I've been saying this for many years now, they think that this is just going to replace everything. Like open source companies, that's only going to be open source companies. There's not going to be any other type of company. That's not what I'm saying. I think in the future, the thing that will also happen, which we have to be prepared for in 20 years, 15, 20 years from now, there's still going to be many fully proprietary software companies. There's going to be many monopolies. There's going to be many massive, giant, completely closed businesses that are really huge, that maybe are $1 trillion companies as one company. Actually, today, many people already realize this. We have many companies that are already $1 trillion companies. Alphabet, which is Google, Apple, and there's maybe 2 or 3 others that I'm blanking on. Meta, Facebook used to be $1 trillion company until pretty recently. So yeah, obviously Microsoft is a $1 trillion company. So I think that we're going to see in the next decade continued massive growth of all the largest monopolies, the largest technology monopolies in the world. But I think what is also going to happen is they will be acquiring many of the up and coming, much larger open source businesses. By the way, some of them are already public companies. So, HashiCorp, Confluent, GitLab, Mongo, Elastic, all these businesses are $5 to $10 billion each. These are actually not super huge businesses. In 10 years, maybe they can be 50, 100 billion, but maybe they get acquired by the trillion-dollar companies at that point, and we start to actually see two things: not only the growth of the commercial open source category on its own, with brand new companies that did not exist 10 years ago grow really large, but we're also probably going to see the largest technology companies in the world, Microsoft, Alphabet, Google, Meta, Facebook, Apple, actually make acquisitions of many of the largest up and coming open source businesses that actually did not exist in the prior decade. And that will cause a transformation, an evolution of many of the largest technology companies to actually start to become more like open source businesses. I also think Amazon will probably start to participate more in, investing in open source ecosystems and businesses. And it's already happened with Amazon Cloud, which is the AWS. They have basically gone from maybe only 5 or 6 open source cloud services on Amazon Cloud, AWS, in the last 5 or 6 years to, I think it's about 25 or 30 first-class cloud services on AWS, all of them based on open source technologies. So that's a very good thing, in my opinion. I think that's more proof, more evidence that this category will continue to become really big.
Yeah, regarding to other tech companies or other companies, they're just like taking advantage of open source, right? They're using open source to build their solution, their closed solution. How do you feel about that? And it's what kind of recommendation do you have to those kind of companies to contribute back to the open source? Like, I don't know, having an OSPO or having a open source program to contribute back?
Yeah, I have a bit of a different perspective on this. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, because of how the open source movement was actually created and founded by Richard Stallman in the 80s. Richard was very religious and very ideological about the motivations for creating this approach, which originally was called free software. And obviously we still have a free software community. And in 1998, it was rebranded as open source, really to kind of minimize and reduce the religious ideology from the movement. Unfortunately, what happened is most people, I think, in the sort of deep open source community, basically use the word that you just described, which is taking advantage. And I actually don't think that that's the right point of view. I think that's the wrong way of looking at this. Open source is really fundamentally very rooted. It's grounded in this idea of removing discrimination from the framework. And it's kind of like freedom of speech. If we think about in the modern world where people have to have the right and the freedom to say what they want to say within the bounds of the law, obviously, they should be able to say that even if you disagree with it, or if it's a very controversial point of view, or it's something that makes you feel uncomfortable. You should be able to say those things. And I believe that open source is the same. It's really free speech for innovation, for technology. And with the cloud providers building amazing services that are more efficient, that are more innovative on open source, I think that's a fundamentally good thing, and more of it will happen and more of it should happen. I think if you look at this big wave that I was just describing earlier, I'll share my screen again. All of the companies in this wave here are powered by open source. That these companies have created tens of trillions of dollars in value in market cap, and many, many, many billionaires, and many people who are millionaires and people who have generated a lot of wealth as well, who work for those companies, because they have created products and services based on open source technology, and has given a lot of leverage to the world. I think what has been a sort of inefficient model, not necessarily a wrong or an evil or a bad model, but I would say just inefficient in terms of the technology innovation, is these companies have decided to make the core of the product proprietary. And so you can take an open source project, many open source projects, you can compile them and integrate them together into a product, and then you can make that entire product proprietary and sell that product. That is how open source works, and it should continue to work that way, and I think it will. What I think we're seeing though in the world, which is proof from this slide here, is we're seeing more and more of these companies, these open core commercial open source companies, in every single category, in every single area of the technology stack, not just developer tools, not just databases, not just infrastructure software. We're seeing application software, we're seeing gaming, we're seeing social networking, we're seeing design and collaboration. Adobe just acquired Figma for $20 billion yesterday. There's 5 or 6 really, really exciting open source design and creativity and graphics rendering open source communities. The Godot game engine, which is a C++ game engine, is a top 50 open source project as far as I know. There's a project called Theater.js, which is a design animation 3D design library for web JavaScript applications, growing really fast. There's a project called Penpot in Spain, which allows you to basically have, similar to Figma or Photoshop, graphic design and creativity features as an application, all open source. And so we're seeing so many more of these companies built here. I don't actually think it's taking advantage for these businesses to build on open source. But what I do think is happening is in the future, we're going to see more and more companies built like this on this kind of foundation, because it's just more efficient and it's better. It's better for the world.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. We have time for a couple of minutes to a final question. I saw in your presentation that you have the Web3 category, and blockchain is obviously based on open source technology. How do you feel about that? And how do you think it will change the cost ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm friends with a handful of the people in this Web3 blockchain community. And one of the things that I have personally gotten kind of a little frustrated with, but I don't think there's any negative intention, is there's such a tiny emphasis and recognition of open source in blockchain and Web3. Instead, all the emphasis on how do we make money, how can we replace the dollar, how can we trade the crypto, how can we go to the moon, when is the next token gonna make us all rich and so we can go buy Lamborghinis? Okay, so that's the wrong emphasis. The emphasis really should be the blockchain architecture and Web3 as a movement would not exist without open source existing before it. Satoshi Nakamoto wrote a white paper, published it on the internet, and then he took the designs from that paper and showed the world, proved to the world that you can implement those ideas in software. And the only way Bitcoin succeeded was because that implementation in C++ was licensed as an MIT project. Bitcoin is an open source, MIT licensed code base. That is the only way Bitcoin actually succeeded. There is no way Bitcoin would have succeeded if it was a proprietary piece of software. So the fundamental truth most people in the crypto Web3 ecosystem do not recognize enough is that crypto Web3 have everything to thank open source. Everything is due to open source before it. Ethereum is the same. When Vitalik Buterin came up with the idea of creating smart contracts on top of this idea of a blockchain and building, Turing complete primitives and, sort of a computational layer on top of this idea of cryptographically verifiable money, which Bitcoin created. it would never have worked had it not been licensed as an open source project. In fact, even more aggressively permissive, Ethereum's license is LGPL. It's not MIT. It's LGPL. Vitalik is even more aggressive about being more permissive with the open source rights that the Ethereum codebase has. So instead, what we've seen in the last decade, because Bitcoin was released in 2008, Ethereum was released in 2013, is we've seen an absolutely huge emphasis on money, financial transactions, and not on actual technology innovation. What's interesting, though, is with the commercial open source ecosystem that I've described, there are companies that have generated tens of billions of dollars in revenue per year across tens of thousands of enterprise customers that employ 80,000 people around the world and have created more than 10 IPOs. Those businesses, I think, are doing the right thing. They're creating valuable products and services in exchange for money, and they're generating sustainable long-term businesses because their core products are based on a core open source project. With the Web3 crypto world, I worry a lot about the emphasis being so much on financial transactions and decentralized finance, and instead, where it really should be focused on, frankly, it should be focused on commercial open source, which is to say, here's maybe a new business model. We have this idea of a token. That's very interesting. But how do we actually build products and services, applications, APIs that are based on open source technology at the core that can unlock a lot more efficiency for customers and for users? I don't think we hear as much about that. And instead, we hear much more about how do you make as much money as you can with this new token? How can you get in on the next, ICO or the next pre-sale or something like this? So it's very financialized and it's overly emphasizing the financialization aspects, and instead dramatically underemphasizing the open source innovation aspects. And so that's kind of my main concern. Having said all of that, I'm actually a huge fan and a huge believer in Web3, whatever you want to call it. Jack Dorsey's calling it Web5. I think that's kind of cool. I actually like that idea a lot better. I think labels and branding for things, they're always going to change. You're always going to have you're going to come up with a new way of describing something that's interesting. But I think the idea of blockchain as a architecture is extremely exciting. It's probably one of the next business models for all software companies in the future. How far away is that? I don't know. Maybe it's 20 years away. Maybe it's 10 years away. Maybe it's 5 years away. I don't know. But I'm a big fan of it for sure.
Okay, thank you, JJ, for sharing your vision and your thoughts with our audience. It's been great to have you here, and I hope you see you soon in a real life.
Sounds good. Congratulations on what you're doing, and thank you for it. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, see you.